Welcome to my YouTube channel and Facebook page. Husantaj from this end. A famous novel of George Eliot, Middlemarch, I brought for you today. George Eliot was born in England in 1819. Her real name was Mary Ann Evans. George Eliot was her pen name. She died in 1880. She was novelist, poet, journalist, and translator. Her famous novels are Silas Marner, Adam Bede, The Mill on the Floss, and Middlemarch. So let's start. Middlemarch is a huge novel. It carries 5 stories in it, which are Miss Dorothea Brooke and Mr. Ladislaw. Second story is Mr. Lydgate and Miss Rosamond Vincy. Third story is Mr. Fred Vincy and Miss Mary Garth. Fourth story is Mr. James Chatham and Miss Celia Brooke. And the last and fifth story is Mr. Bulstrode and Mr. John Raffles. I will discuss 5 stories one by one for your convenience. So, first story is Miss Dorothea Brooke and Mr. Ladislaw. In an unreal village named Middlemarch, 2 orphan sisters named Miss Dorothea Brooke and Miss Celia Brooke lived with their bachelor uncle, Mr. Arthur Brooke. Miss Dorothea was a pretty girl with high aims about life. She wanted to change life of poor farmers. She wanted to build cottages for farmers with better facilities. Her uncle, Mr. Brooke, was not happy with this idea. Mr. James Chatham liked Miss Dorothea a lot and wanted to make marriage with her. He was happily ready to fulfill her desire towards cottages, while Miss Dorothea was attracted to Mr. Edward Casaubon, who was 20 years older to her. But Miss Dorothea took him a scholar and researcher who was writing a book on origins of myths. Soon after marriage, they went to Rome for honeymoon. Miss Dorothea, now she was Mrs. Casaubon, wanted to help her husband in research, but she came to know neither her husband was scholar nor was a man of high brain. Her illusions and high dreams were broken. Mr. Ladislaw, who was cousin of Mr. Casaubon and who met them in Middlemarch, now he came to Rome and met Dorothea again. They started to spend time together because they had same interests. Mr. Casaubon did not like it. The couple came back after a few months. Mr. Ladislaw came to Middlemarch, but Mr. Casaubon asked to go back to London. Mr. Ladislaw refused to do so and started working with Mr. Brooke. Mr. Casaubon fell ill and died, but before his death he wrote a will that if Mrs. Casaubon will marry Mr. Ladislaw, she will be deprived of all property. It was matter of shame for Mrs. Casaubon that Mr. Casaubon thought ill about her, and he thought that she had a secret relation with Mr. Ladislaw. Mr. Ladislaw went to London but came back after a few months. Mrs. Casaubon left all rights of property and married to Mr. Ladislaw. Both shifted to London and led a happy life because they loved each other. They were happy with their son. Second story, that is about Miss Celia Brooke and Mr. James Chatham. Miss Celia Brooke was the younger sister of Miss Dorothea Brooke. She loved her sister a lot. She was not agreed Miss Dorothea's plan to marry with Mr. Casaubon. She said, "Dodo, it is impossible to satisfy you. You never see what is quite plain." When Miss Dorothea married to Mr. Casaubon and went to Rome, Mr. James Chatham was engaged with Miss Celia Brooke. Soon they got married, although Mr. James Chatham was not happy with Mr. Casaubon and Miss Dorothy's marriage, but he was in great opposition of Mr. Ladislaw and disagreed their decision of marriage when Mr. Casaubon died and Mrs. Casaubon decided to make marriage to Will Ladislaw. Mr. James Chatham declared to Celia that he will never go to see Miss Dorothea. In fact, Mr. Chatham and Mrs. Chatham had a son, Arthur, who they were supposing will be heir of Mrs. Casaubon if she does not marry again. But they plant and table was turned by Mrs. Casaubon by marrying Will Ladislaw. At the end of the novel, we see Mr. James Chatham allowed his wife to see her sister, Mrs. Dorothea Will Ladislaw. Mr. Tertius Lydgate and Mrs. Rosamond Lydgate. The young doctor, Mr. Tertius Lydgate, was a new man to Middlemarch. He has chosen a life in a provincial town to escape from intrigues and jealousies of London. Rosamond Vincy, the beautiful but superficial daughter of a local businessman and mayor of Middlemarch, Mr. Vincy. She loved Lydgate. She thinks the local man to be beneath to her, so Lydgate was an outsider. She believes that marrying to Mr. Lydgate would help her to climb the social ladder. Lydgate enjoys flirting to Rose, but he is not in love with her and he is not serious and have no interest to make marriage. When Rose brother Mr. Fred fell ill and Mr. Lydgate visited frequently to Mr. Vincy's home. Mr. Vincy's home and had a relation with Miss Rose. People started spread rumors of engagement of Mr. Lydgate and Miss Rosamond Vincy. Mr. Lydgate stopped his visits, but on their next meeting she cried a lot. Lydgate felt sorry for her. Soon they engaged and then married. Mr. Lydgate's cousin, Mr. Captain Lydgate, visited Middlemarch. Rose got inspired. She believes that his visit will do wonder for them. They often go for a ride. Mr. Lydgate avoids his cousin and is against their horse riding because Rose was pregnant. But Rose did not care, and one day she fell from horse and lost her baby. Soon, Mr. Lydgate told Rose that he has to pay heavy debts because when they got married, he did not have enough money. So, to meet the expenditures, he took loans. Now he was under heavy debts. Now, Rose regrets that why she married to a poor man. Now Rose started to make relations with Will Ladislaw by thinking that he will rescue her from unhappy life. She tried to get money by Captain Lydgate, who refused to do so. Mr. Lydgate asked £1,000 as a loan to Mr. Bulstrode, owner of the hospital. First, Bulstrode refused to provide money, but after that, for an evil act, he gave money to Mr. Lydgate, but this money was heavy stone for Mr. Lydgate. He took money from Mrs. Casaubon and returned to Mr. Bulstrode. Mr. Lydgate moved to London because people thought he was evil partner of Mr. Bulstrode and was helping him to kill Mr. Raffles. At the age of 50, he died and Miss Rose married again to a doctor and lived a happy life. Mr. Fred Vincy and Miss Mary Garth. Rosamond's brother, Mr. Vincy's son, Mr. Fred Vincy failed his theology exams and have a heavy debts because he hired horses, but one horse was injured. Mr. Caleb Garth co-signed the debt because they had a family relation. Mr. Featherstone, who was husband of Mr. Fred Vincy's aunt and now he was widower, widower gave him few pounds, but still he needed 80 pounds. These pounds were paid by Mr. Caleb Garth, but whole family have deprived of their saving to pay debt of Mr. Fred Vincey. Miss Mary Garth was daughter of Mr. Caleb Garth, and Mr. Fred wanted to make marriage with this girl, but she always refused because she did not want him, especially after 80 pounds matter. Fred was disappointed and fell ill. Mr. Lydgate was called and was considered life savior. Mr. Featherstone, who was a rich man, was dying, so Miss Mary Garth was his carrier. One night when he was dying, he asked Mary Garth to bring a box and bring a second will and burn it down. In reward, he will give her gold. Miss Mary Garth refused to do so. Mr. Featherstone died. When Mr. Featherstone's family gathered and will was read out, everyone was surprised because, according to the first will, Mr. Fred was given 10,000 pounds and was here. But according to second will, Joshua Rigg, illegitimate son of Mr. Featherstone, was sole recipient of all fortune. Fred and family left empty-handed. Miss Mary felt herself responsible for all this because she did not burn the will. Mr. Chatham and Mr. Brooke appointed Mr. Caleb Garth manager of their estate. Fred passed his exam, but he did not want to be a clergyman. Mary told Mr. Fred that she will marry him if he is a responsible man. Mr. Fred worked with Mr. Caleb, then is appointed as manager of state of Mr. and Mrs. Bulstrode, who is his aunt too. Now Miss Mary Garth makes marriage with Mr. Fred Vincey and they lived happy life. The last story, it is last important story of the novel Middlemarch, but it is very important because Bulstrode affected on life of Mr. Lydgate, Mr. Fred Vincey and Mr. Will Ladislaw. So we see all the characters of the novel get affected by Mr. Bulstrode either in one way or in another way. Mr. Bulstrode was husband of Mr. Vincey's sister. He was outsider in Middlemarch. When he was young man, he was banker. He worked as broker, business run by Mr. Dunkirk and made property by stolen money. When Mr. Dunkirk died and Mr. Bulstrode married to the widow who was grandmother of Mr. Ladislaw, she asked Bulstrode to find her daughter, mother of Will Ladislaw, who ran away from home for her love. Mr. Bulstrode found the daughter but never told his wife because he wanted to take all property with him. Mr. Raffles knew all the secrets. When she died, Mr. Bulstrode came to Middlemarch, married with Miss Harriet, sister of Mr. Fred Vincey, Mr. Vincey, and led a happy life. After a long time, Mr. John Raffles appeared in Middlemarch and asked Mr. Bulstrode for money. Mr. Bulstrode gave him money and asked him never come back to Middlemarch. Mr. Bulstrode was running a fever hospital in Middlemarch where Mr. Tertius Lydgate was serving as a doctor. Mr. Lydgate, under heavy debts, asked 1,000 pounds to Mr. Bulstrode, but he refused. Mr. John Raffles again came to Bulstrode, but this time he was ill. Mr. Lydgate was providing him treatment. One night when Mr. Bulstrode was staying with Mr. John Raffles, he let him to die because he was provided extra dose of alcohol. Before that, Mr. Bulstrode gave Lydgate £1,000 that night. Raphael died. People suspected that Lydgate was partner in this murder because before dying, John Raphael told whole story to Mr. Caleb Garth, that how Mr. Bulstrode make property, what was the source of property, and what were his evil practices in past. And Mr. Caleb spread the story in all the village. Mr. Lydgate took money, sum of £1,000 from Mrs. Kazaban and paid to Mr. Bulstrode. He left Middlemarch and settled in London, where he died. Mr. Bulstrode confessed his guilt to Mr. Law and told him that how he made evil practices towards his grandmother and to his mother, and he also offered him to share in fortune, but Mr. Law refused to take anything. Now Mrs. Bulstrode gave charge of state to Mr. Fred Vincey as owner and aunt. So we can say Mr. Bulstrode affected life of Mr. Law, Mr. Fred, Mr. Vincey, and almost all the characters in novel. So here was the summary of the novel Middlemarch. It was complicated but well knitted story. It throws light on the people of Middlemarch, their behavior, psychology of people, social circle, life bond, values, norms, profession, gossips, parties, politics, economy, women's say in Society of Middlemarch in detail. I hope so you enjoyed the picture of Middlemarch society. Till my next video, take care of yourself and ciao ciao.